Wesch 8, Part 2, we're continuing with this world system that is synonymous with colonialism that started 500 years ago. The world system started before that, maybe 1,000 years ago or 900, but it really changed. It shifted when the Europeans took it over around 500 years ago. This idea is that the world is not divided into rich and poor. Instead, there's a single system that makes one kind of country rich and another kind of country poor. It's a single system. This is how it works. We need to theorize the global economy. Materialist is our perspective. It's an explanation that focuses on material causes and effects. We follow the money to find out why. Based on the thought of Karl Marx, point this is not communism. Marx was a philosopher, a political theorist, and a historian, in addition to being a journalist professionally and an activist in his spare time. He has had a lasting impact on the fields of economics, political science, and history, and philosophy, as well as anthropology. So he was a materialist in contrast to idealism. An idealist explanation asks what people think and say about why they do things. Materialists don't put as much weight in what people think and say about what they're doing. They put more weight in what it costs and what the payoff is. And so that's the perspective that we're coming from here. We're less interested in what people say about why they do things and more on how doing the things the way they do them pays them, how there's a payoff. It's my perspective, and it's a good way to go, I think, in this world. So development theories, we're going to talk about the way the world is. It makes sense that the colonial world could not develop normally during colonialism. If you take example, the Indian capitalists in the 1850s wanted to build factories in India. So here we have India, and India is a long ways away from Britain. So here's India over here. Zoom out a little bit. Here's India and here's the UK. So this is the political rulers of India in the 1840s, 1850s. We've got cotton fields here. They're growing the cotton. They harvest the cotton. They put it on boats. They take the boat all the way around Africa. They bring it up all the other way up to England. They bring it to Manchester and Birmingham, where they have these big cotton factories, where they process it into thread and then weave it into cloth. And then they pile the cloth back on the boat and take the boat with its sails up and everything all the way back around Africa and back up into the Indian Ocean and all the way to India. And then they sell the cloth, and of course it's terribly expensive because it just went halfway around the world twice to come back in the form of cloth. I mean, it's still cheaper than hand making the cloth on a loom, but it's nowhere near as cheap as if they could just build a factory here, right? Why can't they build the factory here instead of the factory back in India? They could sell it for half the price. It would be economical. It would be more profitable. The capitalists are all in favor. They're like, yeah, let's do this. This is just reasonable. But the people in India cannot vote because they are subjects of the British Empire. The people in Manchester and Liverpool can vote because they are citizens and not subjects. So they go to Parliament. They say, you member of Parliament here, we will vote you out unless you sponsor a bill that makes it illegal to build textile factories in India. Okay, this is horrible. What's this gonna do to the Indian economy down the line? You're never going to develop, and that's exactly what happened. The reason why India was so poor in 1947 was because India was a colonial possession of Britain. After World War II, however, they get their independence, 1947. Colonialism ends. Why did the colonies not immediately start building wealth? Okay? Colonialism is over. The British are no longer robbing you blind. Why aren't you rich now? And so there's three theories that have developed to explain this continued unequal development since 1947. Modernization theory, dependency theory, and world systems theory. So we'll start with the most problematic one, modernization theory. It's a unilineal theory based on the model of developed economies. By studying how Western European and North American economies developed industrial capitalism, modernization theories theorists propose a universal path that formal colonies could all follow to develop. This is bad because it says it's one size fits all. It's also bad because it's ignoring history. It's saying that Britain didn't become rich by robbing India blind, which we've just seen. No, Britain became rich because of the things the British did, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, and 100 years ago, and that's why they're rich today. It just completely conveniently ignores actual history, which was exploitation and domination. The capitalist system was the capitalist system is seen as a naturally occurring evolutionary development that all economies were destined to evolve toward. This is wrong. Capitalism is an artificial human system that was created under specific historical conditions for specific purposes. It has a common logic, but that logic varies tremendously according to the context in which you're trying to do it. But this is the origin of the terms first world, second world, and third world. So under modernization theory, remember this is in the 1950s and the 1960s, we have the first world, which are the highly advanced capitalist democracies like US and West Germany at the time. Then we have the second world. I should put West Germany because there was East Germany too. It was part of the second world. Second world is industrializing socialist and communist countries. Remember, Soviet Union was going much faster than the United States in the 1950s. Got to outer space, manned the space flight faster, developed much more powerful nuclear weapons a lot more quickly. The Soviet Union did that. China is also sort of a little bit behind in terms of their development, but they are a socialist country, communist country. The second world. And then the third world is the poor, undeveloped countries like Vietnam and Nigeria. And that third world is still, it's still a common term, although a lot of people hate it. So in contrast to that, we have dependency theory. This is the 1970s and 1980s, revolutionary movements that opposed capitalist Western domination. These people argued that inequality is inherent in capitalism and that the problems of poor countries were created by the West. Instead of seeing poverty, they saw impoverishment. Instead of seeing the lack of development, they saw underdevelopment. These are conditions intentionally created to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. The wealth of the developed nations, like that of the quote-unquote parasitic bourgeois class, is dependent on the continued impoverishment of the poor nations. Now, this makes sense empirically. You can see that that it really does look like the game is fixed. For the rich countries. The rich countries are going to set up the system, control the system, and make sure that they continue to win. But it isn't a conspiracy like that. Capitalism doesn't really work like that. Capitalists do not want to crush the poor. They like their workers. They like their workers to work and their consumers to consume. They want to buy the labor of the workers for the lowest price possible and sell their products to the consumers at the highest price possible. But they don't really hate them. Who they really hate is the competitors. If you talk to any business owner, he's pretty happy with his customers and his suppliers. He does not want his competitors to exist anymore. Always trying to crush the competition. So it's sort of like collateral damage. It's not a conspiracy like that. It's just how the system works. And so that's the third conclusion, was world systems theory from the 1980s to the present. This is still pretty much where we are today. In terms of development theory, we're all just sort of continuing to modify and tweak Wallerstein. So Wallerstein's idea is that capitalism could be studied functionally as a global economic system focused on the international division of labor, the way that certain kinds of workers typify an entire nation's workforce. And here we have the concepts of core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So the periphery is the former colonies whose economies were organized around extraction. This used to be called the third world, but it's not just that they're poor countries. It's that they are not industrialized. They have low levels of technology. They have no control over finance. They cannot raise capital. They don't have capital. That's the problem. And they're largely agriculturally based. Extraction of resources out of them, out of the soil, in mining or agriculture, out of the sea in terms of fishing, out of the forest in terms of logging. The semi-periphery, these are countries that once belonged to the core, like Argentina and China, or that may soon be core economies, like Brazil and South Korea. These are the ones that we call them emerging markets sometimes in economics. So we're looking at countries that are building factories, but they still don't have any control over finance. They still don't have really high-tech industry. They're not fully industrialized in the same way that the core economies are. The core economies, the U.S. and Germany, again, they're industrialized. They control technology and finance. They have R&D. They have huge investment banks, and they pay high wages to skilled workers. So we can see the division of labor. If you take an economics class and you learn about divisions of labor, we have a primary division of labor. That's you're working in the extraction of raw materials. You're cutting down trees. You're fishing out of the sea. You're mining stuff out of the ground, or you're working in agriculture. The secondary division of labor, and this typifies what life is like for people for the majority of people in peripheral economies. Secondary is the processing of raw materials. You're working in a factory somewhere, manufacturing heavy or light industry. This is what it's like in Brazil or in China, typically for a worker. And then the tertiary level is services, finance, banking, and investment, communications, health, education, high tech, and that's the majority of jobs. Like 70–80% of U.S. jobs are services, and this is the best resolution to why development doesn't work, even though there's no outright conspiracy to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. It's a constituent feature of the system to maintain the international division of labor. Okay, we'll come back to this.